Good afternoon. I've just briefed the Council on my visit to Damascus on Saturday, on my concerns at the deteriorating security situation in Syria, its impact on neighboring countries, particularly Jordan, Lebanon and Turkey, in terms of the numbers of refugees, which has now crossed 500,000 who have fled the country. In my meetings in Damascus on Saturday, I asked the government to allow the United Nations to import fuel because the shortage of fuel is impeding our humanitarian operations. I asked them to consider 10 additional international NGO organizations being able to work in the country so that we are able to scale up our activities significantly, and I also reassured them that the United Nations humanitarian organizations had every intention to continue to work in Syria to help those people in need. I'll stop there, and I'm very happy to take questions.
So, the first question, of course, will be after what you said. Will be what was the response of the Syrian government after you made that request to them, to allow these NGOs to come in and to allow the United Nations to function as you had asked them to? What did they say?
On the issue of the importation of fuel, I have been promised an answer tomorrow. This is extremely urgent because if we are not able to get fuel, then we are not able to get trucks to move around the country with urgently needed supplies. On the issue of the 10 additional international NGOs, we have given the government a list. They have undertaken to look at that list. I've asked them to come back to us as quickly as possible. The government reiterated their commitment, which they gave to myself and the Secretary General in September, that we can move around the country. I also informed the government that we will be making greater contacts with the opposition inside of Syria itself.
Can you explain? The UN said that it was pulling out, a quarter of its staff, that it was too dangerous. How would you explain the UN pulling out and NGOs going in, and also what's been the impact of this pullback of 25 workers? If that's what it is, and what's been the impact on the humanitarian work?
Well, first of all, what we said was that if there were any non-essential staff, i.e. any international staff in country that were not contributing to the urgent humanitarian operation, that consideration should be given to relocating those staff out of Damascus. So I think it's very, very important that we remember that this is staff who are non-essential and not critical to our ongoing humanitarian operations. Having said that, I heard shelling all day long when I was in Damascus on Saturday, so it's clear that the security situation remains volatile. So we are looking at a range of options. How do we continue to operate inside Syria, out of Damascus, security permitting? Looking at the other offices that we have across Syria, we used to have 8 different parts of the country where we were located. We've had to relocate people out of 2 of those. We have national staff in 5 other locations, plus Damascus, which makes 6 operating across the country. Can we move staff, for example, to some of those other locations where it may be safer than Damascus is right now? So we're looking at a range of options.
Can you say what you're going to be doing with weapons and, with the opposition? And then the second question is, I guess I've read in places that a piece of what happens with humanitarian aid in some cases, and I don't know which cases, is that the humanitarian aid is used to disguise the import of weapons to the opposition. Do you have any means of making sure that this doesn't happen or checking on this?
Well, I am absolutely clear that in terms of the aid that we are supplying as a United Nations, that there is absolutely no evidence that any of this is in any way used to divert or bring in supplies of weapons to the opposition. And I've made this very, very plain to the government. They have not ever put any evidence to me. What they have said is that they have a concern that humanitarian operations could be used in that way. We have absolutely no evidence of it in terms of what we are doing on the humanitarian side from the United Nations with the organizations that we are working with. In the medium to longer term, and immediately, what are we doing with the opposition? Of course, we are having conversations with the new humanitarian unit, the Assessment and Coordination Unit, that has been formed under the umbrella of the opposition. It is a purely humanitarian unit, so we are talking to them. But the key thing for me out of Saturday's conversation was on informing the government that if we are truly to make maximum use of the access that the government say that we can have, it means we have to cross lines. We have to move from government-controlled areas into disputed areas, into opposition-controlled areas. That means that we have to talk to the opposition on the ground. Our job as humanitarians is to be entirely impartial and neutral in the way that we deliver aid. If we're going to get to all Syrians, we must do that. The government accepted that.
Thank you, ma'am. Just a follow-up to that, and from what you were saying, what is the nature of the level of communication that you're having both with the Syrian government and the different opposition groups? You can grade it A to F if you like. I mean, but as you said, you need to communicate with these groups in order to get where you need to go.
Yes, so on the ground, and that is why on the ground, we are going to have to now speak more to those organizations, because if we're going to get aid into people, we have to get aid into much more aid into those opposition-controlled areas. Aid is going into those areas now because, of course, we're working with a range of local partners as well as the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. But if you look at a map, for example, of the greater Damascus region, you will see and plot the areas that are disputed, the areas that are opposition-controlled, and the areas that are government-controlled. That is changing all the time, and there are significant areas which are opposition-controlled. So we have to have more discussion on the ground, because the people who, for example, man the checkpoints have to understand and know what we do to allow our convoys to come in.
To go from one opposition-controlled area to another opposition-controlled area, do you need to have a number of different conversations with each individual opposition group, or is there one conversation that you can have to clarify this?
There is one conversation or an overarching conversation that you can have outside of Syria, because of the way that the opposition have come together and created the coordination unit to look at humanitarian issues. On the ground, it is much more complicated because you have a much broader span of command and control in different local areas. So that conversation has to be with a wealth of different organizations on the ground.
With regard to that, is that with the local? Because what I've heard from somebody who was in Syria and looking at the situation, that he said all the local ones didn't take orders from anybody else. Is that your understanding, that there's many of those local in the opposition or with guns manning checkpoints that don't take the orders, and that how will you deal with that if that's the case?
My understanding is that the command and control mechanisms are much more fragmented, which is why we need to talk to a number of different organizations on the ground.
You just mentioned Turkey and Lebanon, a refugee situation in Turkey and Lebanon.
And Jordan and Iraq.
And Jordan? You didn't say anything about it. The situation in Jordan is the same, or are the refugees also pouring into Jordan as much as they are going into Turkey?
There are 5 areas where there are significant refugee flows: Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, Iraq, and increasingly North Africa. We are talking here about registered refugees because there are a lot more people who have fled who have not registered as refugees. And we have passed the 500,000 mark in terms of people who have registered as refugees. The most significant impact in terms of numbers is on Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. I visited Jordan and Lebanon myself 2 weeks ago, was able to talk to a number of senior people in government, including having a conversation with the king in Jordan itself. You will know that the Secretary General recently himself visited Jordan and Turkey. The Deputy Secretary General recently visited Lebanon, and a number of my colleagues from UN agencies have visited the region in recent weeks. So we're looking at this in terms of the people inside of Syria and what we can do to help them, as well as in neighboring countries. We have to recognize that a lot of host communities in neighboring countries, as well as Syrians themselves, have taken a huge burden in terms of looking after people who have been displaced or looking after refugees. But the communities themselves are now running out of that ability to provide that support.
What's your understanding of what's happened in this Yarmouk camp? There seems to be, it's a long-standing camp that the FSA was trying to enter, the government bombed it. Who controls it and how does it change your work there? And if you don't mind, I wanted to ask you one question about the Congo. What's OCHA doing?
Can we come back to the Congo after I finish the Syria questions?
Okay, sure.
Yarmouk hosts about 106,000 Palestinian refugees. We are not able yet to verify the numbers of people who were killed as a result of the airstrikes. The situation, as you can imagine, is pretty chaotic right now. As soon as we have any further information, we will, of course, make that available.
What the impact will be of countries like the U.S., U.K., et cetera, having recognized this rebel group as the legitimate government of Syria. What impact will that have on your work?
That's a political decision that those countries have made, and in terms of making a specific impact on our work, none at present. I mean, we, as humanitarian organizations, will continue to work with the government, with the opposition. We talk and have the clearance as a result of our mandate from the General Assembly to talk to whoever we need to talk to get aid to the people that need that aid, because the work that we do is impartial, it's independent, it's not about a political agenda.
With respect to the fact that the council meeting was closed door today, the Permanent Five particularly has been so polarized on the issue of Syria. Can you describe the reaction of Permanent Five countries to your humanitarian briefing today? One would hope it might be a little more unified.
All council members, and this has been my experience in briefing the council on the humanitarian situation in Syria from the very first briefing that I have ever done, have been unified in their support for urgent humanitarian action. What I was drawing to the attention, particularly of the Council today, are my continuing concerns about the brutal nature of this conflict, the impact on civilians, drawing their attention to some of the stories that I've heard with respect to sexual and gender-based violence from women refugees that I spoke to recently in Jordan. We have to remember that the consequences of this conflict have a very human face. It is a human tragedy, and I wanted the Council to remember this.
Do you have any idea as to, any idea, offhand, that how many refugees could be unaccounted for, like 50,000? 10,000.
That's very hard, because I don't know if you saw, there were recent reports 2 or 3 days ago about refugees who, for example, have now fled to Sweden. Significant numbers, thousands that have fled to Sweden. Egypt is talking about the numbers of refugees that they are now receiving from Syria. So we are talking about the numbers in those neighboring countries. Our Syria refugee response plan is really about Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, but actually the numbers are much bigger than that. And as I said, the numbers of people who have not registered, including in Lebanon and Jordan, is much higher, because these are countries that have open borders with Syria, have had over a very long period of time, and where communities have shared a great deal over many years. I will take one last question on Syria, then the question on DRC, and that.
According to what I've heard is when people go to areas where the opposition is and their local groups, they have no means of those local groups don't know who they are and can do many different things with regard to them. What will be the mechanism of your protecting people who go into situations like that? Or is that the NGOs protect themselves? How do you provide for situations when somebody goes into an area where there's some local group not responding to anybody else, and they are, they challenge the people who go, and there's a danger for those humanitarian workers?
I think that we have seen over the last few months that the situation for humanitarian workers has become more dangerous. A number of people from the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, for example, have been targeted and killed. Very brave volunteers. The security situation, I think we all continue to say, in Syria is volatile and difficult, and it can change day on day. We have a duty of care to our staff, of course, because we are used to working in fragile and difficult environments. We have ways of assessing and managing risk, as do our colleagues working on the ground, but the situation does remain difficult. Final question on the DRC.